When someone leaves and builds a new life, we usually focus on the person who left, the courage it took, the risk, the transformation. We talk about what they gained. What we almost never talk about is what changed for the people who stayed. Not in a dramatic way and not in a tragic way, just quietly. I'm going to explain this to you in the form of a story. David left to Australia to build a new life somewhere else. At the time, it felt clear to him. He was young enough to start over, restless enough to try, and certain enough to go. Years later, David will look back and realize something that surprised him. What surprised him was that the life he left didn't freeze, it didn't pause, and it didn't wait for him. It continued. And that realization came with weight. But while David was gone, something else was happening too. Something that didn't get labeled as loss, because the person who experienced it never left. So David had a cousin named Tony. They grew up close. Not just family close, but rhythm close. They talked often, they met up without planning too much, they worked on ideas together, they went out together, they filled time together. It wasn't constant, it wasn't intense, it was just built into life. Tony didn't think much about it, it was just how things were. When David decided to leave, it didn't feel like an ending. There was no fight, no falling out, no final night where everything was said. It was framed as temporary, as something that could be revisited. They said things like, "We'll keep in touch. Nothing really changes, and we'll see what happens." And at first, nothing felt different. Tony still woke up the same way, still worked the same way, still lived in the same city. Life didn't collapse. And that's important because when life doesn't collapse, people assume nothing was lost. But something did change. Tony stopped texting David about small things. Not consciously, it just felt unnecessary. Time zones made replies slower. Life filled the gaps. Plans that used to include David simply stopped being suggested. Not because Tony was avoiding the thought, but because the logistics didn't make sense anymore. Life reorganized itself. So months passed, then years passed, and David became someone Tony checked in with instead of someone he built days around. Tony didn't feel sad every day, and he didn't sit with longing. Most days were normal, and that's what made it strange, because it's a different kind of loss. Every once in a while, something would happen. A business idea that would have been perfect for David. A joke that only David would have gotten. A situation where Tony instinctively thought, "I should tell him this," and then he didn't. Not because he couldn't, but because it no longer fit the shape of life. Those moments passed quickly, but they added up. So over time, Tony adapted. He built other relationships, he made new routines, he found different ways to spend time, and life stayed full. That's the part no one talks about. The people who stay don't live in emptiness, they live in a restructured life, and restructuring works. But the realization comes later. Years later, David visits. Him and Tony get together, they talk easily, everything feels familiar. But something's not the same. They're not out of sync, They're just no longer aligned. The closeness is still there, but it's no longer active, it's historical. David realizes something in that moment, that while he was building a new life, the old one didn't disappear. It just continued without him. And the realization isn't guilt, it's clarity. But Tony has a parallel realization. His own realization didn't happen in just one moment, it happened gradually. He realizes that a version of life existed that no longer does. Not because anyone did anything wrong, not because of distance alone, but because life can only be lived forward. Now, Tony doesn't feel abandoned. That word is just too strong to describe it. And he doesn't feel resentful either. But he feels something else that's not as heavy and it's not as loud. That a certain version of himself only existed in a life where David was still there. And that version ended. So the unspoken truth of the story is this. No one teaches you how to grieve a life that ended without breaking. There was no rupture, no betrayal, no clear moment to point to. Just a slow replacement of one rhythm with another. When people say attachment causes suffering, they're missing something. Tony didn't suffer because he was attached. He suffered because he became aware of a life that quietly stopped continuing. The suffering wasn't emotional chaos, it was just recognition. David paid the cost of leaving, and Tony paid the cost of staying. Different experiences, but still the same truth. One choice created two altered lives. Some people leave and carry the memory of what they didn't live, and others stay and carry the absence of someone who no longer fits. Neither is wrong and neither is dramatic. It's just how life works. Every choice creates a life, and quietly, it ends another.